hours and hours of conversation there. He is Jack Kirby's biography. He worked with Jack Kirby at a young age, and that's been part of Mark's career path. Mark is the author of a splendid book from about 6 years ago called Kirby, King of Comics. He's also the editor of another splendid book that came out just last year called The Art of the Simon and Kirby Studio. Those are the early days of Kirby's career in the 40s and 50s. You see some of it right here on this wall, for example. Mark's a prolific writer for comics and for television, for various media and forms, but he's particularly known for working on television, for example, on animated television series such as the Garfield and Friends show. I know him from comic book work, Gru the Wanderer, D and Agents, Crossfire, a number of comics that he's written over the years. Mark's blogs and columns are a trove of information about television, animation, comedy, voice acting, you name it, and of course, comics. Mark has researched Jack's life and work for many years and is working on a definitive, I'm going to imagine, brick-like biographical tome about Jack Kirby that we will see in these coming years. I asked Mark here to share with, Mark to come here and share with us today some thoughts about Kirby's extraordinary life and work. So please join me in welcoming our special guest, Mark Evanier.
Karaoke bar right now. So I will favor you with a few numbers later. Thank you. I'm not the only person in this room who knew Jack Kirby. With a few number of people who are recognized. You will notice these people because as I talk about what a wonderful fellow human being Jack was, those will be the people nodding their heads in agreement. I don't know anybody who ever met Jack who wasn't amazed by how generous he was, how nice he was. People joke and call him the king of the comics, and to the extent he was the king of the comics, he was a king who did not believe in a caste system. Everybody was equal. He treated you like he treated the youngest beginning artist who was just struggling to start learning how to put the pencil to the paper, like he treated a fellow professional, like he treated everyone around him. It was one of the amazing things about Jack. Another amazing thing about Jack was his brain. A lot of people didn't immediately pick up on how smart Jack was. I've met some pretty smart people in my life. Jack probably was the one most deserving of that off-the-line word genius. The reason people didn't always understand how smart he was twofold. Well, I'll tell you one. One is, Jack grew up Lower East Side, New York, and he was reared on Warner Brothers gangster movies, and he talked sometimes like someone in one of those movies. And if you don't believe me, if you go to YouTube, there's a few interviews with Jack out there. And in the interviews, Jack was always a little stiffer, and his sense of humor went away the minute you put a camera on him, and he talked very seriously. But he was a brilliant, funny man. The other thing was that his brain operated in several worlds at the same time, occasionally this one, but not always. And he was always fantasizing and thinking of story ideas and jumping around. Jack was not allowed to drive a car because the few times he tried it, he would forget he was on a road, think he was on a rainbow bridge, and drive off the side. Things like that. So when you talk to Jack, his mind just leaped from concept to concept, and he didn't bother with these things that some of mere mortals call segues. He would start talking to you about one thing, and then you'd blink and he'd be talking about something else. And there was a connection there somehow in his mind, but you weren't smart enough, at least I wasn't smart enough always, to pick up on what it was. The way I tell this to people sometimes is, most people when they talk to you, their minds go from A to B to C to D. Jack would start with A, go to R, come back and do G, jump around later and do K, and at some point he'd have you on beyond zebra, someplace, some whole new language. And that was part of the man's genius as a creator. I believe, and this is an observation that is, you kind of have to know a lot of these comics in detail to understand why I feel this way, but a lot of what Jack did was to take two different things, or sometimes three different things, which nobody would ever associate. and he would put them together, and he would get something that resembled none of the components and was a brilliant concept. Here is an example here, and this is really reaching. If you ever read the first Thor story, the first story of Thor, God of Thunder, you all know the character. In the first story, Thor fought the giant stone men, like these aliens that look like the stone men on Easter Island. Now, you know, if you came to any writer and said, we're going to do Thor, God of Thunder, what should the first story be about? I don't think too many other people would say, let's have space aliens who look like the Easter Island statue. And yet, that's what came into Jack's brain. And the story was wonderful. It worked perfectly that way. How did he get to it? Believe it or not, I think this is the reason. And this is one of the few times I think I ever followed the whole path. Jack had read the book Kon-Tiki, which was about Easter Island and things. Who wrote the book Kon-Tiki? Thor Heyerdahl. A lot of his work had these things in it, working on different levels, and then of course frequently, if I did manage to track what he was doing, because he would explain it to me, and I wouldn't understand it, he would lose me at some point. When I worked for Jack for a few years in the early 70s, my major contribution was to stay out of his way. I always understood, people say, oh, you were Jack Kirby's assistant, and you did this. And on Saturday night, when we were at this exhibit here, we were going around, and people were asking me, did you work on this page? There's actually pages on these walls that I handled and touched and did production work on. And there's even one where I drew a tiny part of the page. And the closest I ever in my life come to having my artwork hung in an art gallery was on the other side of this wall, where I drew some of the backgrounds of one of the drawings. But I always try to emphasize to people that for the wonderment of that work that he produced while I was in his clinic, I deserve absolutely zero credit, not a bit of it, because my main contribution was that Jack would tell me the story he was going to do, and I'd say, hey Jack, that sounds great, and then I would leave. And I think I deserve enormous credit for not doing anything. And then I'd come back the next week. I was working with a fellow named Steve Sherman, who was also here Saturday night. We were partners at the time, up in Jack. And Jack would show us the issue that he had drawn. He told us the story about the week before. And it would have nothing to do with what he told us. And I'd say, gee, Jack, that's great. And it was probably better. It was arguably better. It was brilliant in a different way. It was just another great Kirby story. And I'd say, where's the story, part of the story about those aliens you told us about? He'd go, he had no idea how he got from where he started. He had not created the story he had intended to. His brain just raced ahead of him and put things together, and the story was perfectly fine for that. Years later, I worked a lot with improvisational comedians, and I taught improv comedy for a while. And I found a parallel to what Jack did on the page to what improv comedians do. Jack, by the nature of the comic business, and something also deep within him, had to work very fast. An ordinary comic book artist, you take any of these pages here, Jack would draw, with a few exceptions, Jack would draw the page in pencil, and another artist would ink the page in later. Others would put in the letter in. Jack would not letter. Rarely, that black magic cover up there is one of the few pieces in this gallery he actually inked. And he didn't want to ink because once he drew the story in pencil, he was done with it. He didn't want to spend time working on the same story. He wanted to get on to the next story. But even working just in pencil would take most artists who did work this detail all day to do 2 pages. Jack would do at least 3. Sometimes 4, occasionally 6. Now, obviously he was very fast, and what he did, if you're going to do 6 pages a day, you can't sit around for hours thinking about what goes in each panel. You just have to go and do it like an improvisational comedian. In improv, we teach you how to not think and say. We teach you to think as you're saying. To just become the character, get in the scene, and just say whatever the character would say. And Jack did that with his characters. He would sit there and I watched him work. The description that Charles said earlier about someone had seen him start at one corner of the page and just fill in, that was me describing that. And I would watch him draw, and it looked like there was a hidden drawing on that blank paper that only he could see, and he was just tracing it. He could start at any part of the page, and the perspective would all work for him when he finished, and the whole scene would have a totality and unity to it. Well, he would, as he sat there working on that, every so often you'd see it, body language, and that was the body language of Captain America punching someone out. Or he would have this anger would well up with him, and he was drawing a scene of the villain. I have this theory, this is, I wrote Jack in 1970, that most of the villains in Jack's work were on some level Richard Nixon. He hated Richard Nixon, and we talked about Nixon a lot, and Nixon was, I think, informed a lot of Jack's work. Anytime in these pages, if you look around the wall, you see the really horrible villain who was drawn between about 1968 and 1976, it's Nixon, trust me. And he not only, but the thing about Jack was not only that he was fast, his amazing lifetime output was a function of two things. One was how fast he was, the second was how hard he worked. When people ask me, what did you learn from Jack? Well, I could spend 3 days telling you things I learned from Jack and things I'm still learning from Jack. But one of the things was one day when I looked at Jack, when I was a beginning writer, I had a little bit of a career, but you know, for your first few years as a professional writer, you're never sure that they're going to tap you on the shoulder and say, okay, that's enough. Go get a job at Sears. You know? I looked at Jack and I said, you know, I'm never going to be able to be as brilliant as that. I'm certainly not going to draw as well as he did. I don't think I can ever write as well as he did. But I think I could work that hard. That was possible for me. And to make that kind of commitment, and Jack worked like nobody would ever see. He would get up in the morning about 11 a.m. because he worked at night, and he'd putter around for an hour having breakfast, looking at the newspaper, things of that sort. And then he would go to the drawing board, and he would essentially stay there until 4 in the morning. Mm. He would take an hour out for dinner, he might take a half hour out to watch a TV show he liked, but he just worked and worked and worked in his little office in his home, and he loved it, and he got lost in it. His wife, Roz, he had this wonderful wife named Roz. Was one of the sweetest. This was an inseparable couple. A year or so after Jack passed away, he died in 1994, bunch of us were sitting around. Somebody asked Roz, do you think Jack ever cheated on you? And she said, when? He would have had to have someone stashed in the car outside when I went to Ralph's, and he threw at her by the time I got back with the pot roast. And she would wake up at 4 in the morning and go, look, realize this side of the bed was empty, and she'd get up and walk into the studio and say, come on, Kirby, come to bed, it's time to sleep. He'd go, just give me 5 more minutes. I gotta save the universe here, man. And he just worked like crazy. And if you look at these pages, I think one of the things you'll see is hard work. One of the things you won't see about these pages, I'm going to tell you about the only problem with this wonderful showing here, I'm not faulting it in one, but I love this place, is that to really appreciate Jack's brilliance, you have to read whole stories. Looking at individual pages is wonderful. You see the wonderful thing. You'll see storytelling in those pages. In the background, you'll see things happening. You'll see characters in a crowd scene who were ad-lib. They were only in that one panel, but they have a story. They have a purpose. Jack never drew anything without knowing who the people were, what they were doing, making up a little story of context. You have to see the story, because the stories are brilliant. And the stories are what captivated us. And if you're not familiar with Jack's work, and you love these pictures, go find whole books. Almost everything he did is in print now. It has had an enduring quality. People still buy. Generations unborn when he did the work are buying hardcover collections of Jack's work. And this is another thing that's interesting. As Charles was noting, these were done for trimming little newsprint comics. This artwork was all done for that. He was paid bad money. When I first read Jack Kirby comics, they were a dime. When I was working for him, they were 50 15 cents. They were printed on the cheapest paper possible. If you had gone to the publisher and said, hey, we've got a cheaper way to print the comics, he would have said, fine, no matter what it did to the imagery there. And Jack put in a lot more work, as you can see on his pages, than the printing techniques of the time would allow you to see, because he knew that stuff was going to be printed someday, hardcover, on big pages, white paper, and good printing. He knew that. He knew a lot of stuff. He was so prescient. He knew there would be a gallery. People said to me Saturday night, what do you think Jack would have said about this gallery show? I would have said, I told you so. And that's what the question people say to me, do you think Jack would have known someday that Thor would be a multi-million-dollar movie, or the Avengers would be a multi-million? I said, of course, he subconsciently would be. And back in the 70s and the 60s, when he told that to the publishers, they went, yeah, Jack, you should. Go home and draw the next issue. They didn't believe him. He was really a prophet whose genius was not recognized at the time. And that's one of the reasons that he didn't get monetarily the kind of rewards that he deserved. Because you can't get people of no vision to pay you money based on what the work's going to be worth in 5 years or 10 years. You can't, and that's why among his many talents, he was not making himself wealthy. He was really good at making his publishers wealthy. He was really good at giving some of his associates more credit than they deserved. And he just had that little problem of getting it for himself. And how much longer do I got for you? Okay. Now another thing about this exhibit, I'll tell you what Jack would have liked best in this exhibit. I realized this Saturday night, and I'm absolutely certain of this. I'm always very reticent when people say, what would Jack have thought about this? You know, because his mind was so brilliant, I can't. How do you predict the mind of that brilliant? But I can tell you what he would have loved about this exhibit. I'm standing in front of him. He would have walked in and went, look at that big red wall. He loved things in your face, and he would have loved this panel being blown up so much. And he would have said, that's the size comics should always be. In fact, I should draw them that size and they should print them bigger. He loved size. He hated the idea of digest-sized comics or little tiny paperback comics. He wanted them big. The only thing wrong with this drawing is it's not in color, but fortunately it's the Silver Surfer, who's almost all white anyway, so it doesn't matter. He would have loved this. You can see this page over around the corner. The original artist is over. That's Ram Hoffman who's playing there. And if you take a moment to read that page, you will see a moment of comic book history. This is the Silver Surfer, who was born as a character of infinite peace and naivete. In the original story, which the Silver Surfer first appeared, one of those concepts that, you know, Jack did not get a writing credit on an issue. He wrote that. That was his idea, his concept, his storytelling. And the Silver Surfer, who was later described, I think, stretching the imagery a little bit as a Christ figure. The Silver Surfer was this creature born of pure energy who was running around the universe trying to understand us strange mortals, trying to understand what love was and what hate was and why we went to war and why we tried to kill one another and such. And then later, other people handled the character, and the character went off in different directions. And it wasn't the same character Jack knew. He was very upset about that from a creative standpoint. Because generally, while he didn't get paid well for the work, and generally why he didn't get the proper credit for the work sometimes, he generally still got to tell his stories, which meant a lot to him. And you can't really tell your stories when your characters are being inverted and turned into something you didn't intend. So other people had done the Silver Surfer comic, and it wasn't selling. So they put Jack back on the Silver Surfer for one issue. And he did this one story. This is the last page of that one issue that he did, where he was trying to kind of course correct the character and send him off a new direction. And everybody said, you've got to make the character harsher and more powerful. The reason the book wasn't selling is because the character is too meek and ineffectual. Jack didn't think there was anything wrong with meek and ineffectual because people in this world are meek and ineffectual. And the character had power, he just didn't use it with a motive that was venal or anger. He was a character who did not know anger. They gave him anger. During the drawing of this story, Jack had some business-type problems in life. It's a very long story that happened. He got really, really mad at them. He was really, really mad at them when he drew this page. And he wrote approximations of the dialogue in the margins. He did then, and the dialogue writers polish and finesse and paraphrase. And the dialogue on this page sounds to me like it was written by Jack, vowing to lash out at his enemies and such. Take a moment before you leave here and read the dialogue on that page. That's the anger of Jack Kirby coming through. Isn't this a pretty angry page drawing? I can't think of a drawing in my life I've ever seen by any artist that captured the pain of anger, the anguish so much, because anger can be a function of pain, a cry for help at the same time. That's this drawing. It's an amazing drawing. Read that, please. And
we can go to questions.
Sure. Okay.
Questions? Anybody?
Yeah. Any questions about Jack?
And Charles too?
Yeah, and Charles. Yes. No, right over here.
So I have a question. Whenever they show pictures of Jack with his phone and everything, they always show him with his art. Did he surround himself with any artists that he liked?
Did Jack surround himself with any artists he liked? Yeah, he loved everything. That was one of the great. He loved everything. I've never heard Jack say a disparaging word about another artist. He would keep his mouth shut if he didn't get anything out of it. The only type of artwork that he ever faulted was artwork that looked lazy or imitated. If it was original, he loved it. He had, in his studio, he had lots of old pulp magazines. He loved the old science fiction pulps, the old Things with the Shadow. He loved books of comics, other artists. He loved Milton Caniff. He loved Hal Foster. There was an artist, and I don't think I've ever seen any of the many Kirby articles, including my own, that mentioned this. There was a comic strip artist from the 30s named Will Gould, a relation to Chester Gould. If you look at Will Gould, you'll understand where Jack got a few of his ideas also. And he loved old science fiction movies. Someone could write a treatise about how the early Marvel superheroes have scenes and ideas taken from The Amazing Colossal Man. And all these things. The Saturday matinee thing, they took some meal to it. The movies were very big.
Right here. Yes.
Well, a lot of these pages, the question was, who wrote the dialogue with Jack Kirby? Jack worked with other people a lot because of the nature of the business. Everything in this gallery after about 1970, with maybe one or two exceptions, Jack wrote the dialogue on people everything. Prior to that, he worked with other writers. When they gave him scripts, he didn't follow them very closely, if at all. A lot of the Marvel stuff, they would have a plot conference sometimes, they would have discuss, they'd make some notes and things, Jack would go home, but he would not be drawing, when I read a script for another artist, today when I'm writing comic books, usually I see panel 1, the character's running down the screen, and he does this, and he says this. Panel 2, I tell the background, I see. Then in panel 2, this happens, in panel 2. Jack decided what happened in every panel. He controlled the action, and he would write notes to the dialogue writer, saying, here's what I have. If you look at some of these pages, you can see his notes in the margins of the stuff pre-1970.
And you'll see here with the Thor story from 1968, you see the pencil notes written in those margins. Those are in Jack Kirby's handwriting. The finished dialogue is written by Stan Lee, who's rather famous in his own right. You can see the kind of cueing that Kirby provided in the margins. As you can also see over here in the first gallery, just behind the painting here, in the fantastic 4 pages from 1967, 68. You can see that. Whereas by the time he got to this kind of work in the gallery behind us, he was, as Mark said, entirely writing dialogue on his own because he was tired of working, I think, under that arrangement.
Well, yeah, he didn't feel it was effective for him. He didn't feel it was fair. He was doing somebody else's work and they were not getting the credit for the money for it, he felt. And also, the analogy I give people is the great songwriter in Berlin. People would say that in Berlin, you write the lyrics first or the music, and the answer was, I don't separate them in my mind. They come to me as one. I can't write lyrics to somebody else's music. I can't write music to somebody else's lyrics. The way my mind works, they're a simple process. And Jack was like that with comics. When he drew a story written by somebody else, he was still writing it his version. He was just trying to use as much of their input as worked for him or was required to. And he never followed scripts exactly because he was basically a writer, artist. That's why I keep urging people, and yes, look at the pretty pictures, but go read some Kirby comics because you're missing a whole level of his brilliance by looking at the individual pages. And the lady just behind this. What character caught his attention the most in creative? Well, there's 2 or 3, actually every character Jack did was autobiographical in some way, particularly the ones who have cigars, but all of them to some extent. He had a character called Sergeant Fury, Nick Fury, who was Nick Fury, agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., and Sergeant Fury was work kind of things. And then he also had the Thing, big monster with the actually smoked cigars, and Jack would sometimes show Nick Fury in the way I wish people saw me. The Thing is probably the way they do see me. And they both talked a little like Jack. They both had autobiographical elements. Sergeant Fury's early adventures, the ones Jack worked on himself, are autobiographical in some way to Jack's wartime experiences. If we have more time, I talk more about the impact of World War II on Jack. He served with honor. He saw people die at his feet. He was he came back a very different man. To his dying day, he would have nightmares about World War II. He would have a cold sweat in the middle of the night, remembering, thinking he was back out there with people trying to kill him and him trying to kill him. But every Kirby character has autobiographical elements in it. And one of the amazing things to me is I will now, these days, read a Kirby comic done in 1964 or 1953, whatever it is, that I've read 12 times, and suddenly I'll go, oh, that's Jack. Oh, there he is there. Well, I keep seeing parts of his life and seeing elements, and I don't know why I didn't see it the last 6 times. You know, if a measure of great art is that it speaks to you with repeated viewings and says new things, that's where he measures up, because I keep finding one of Charles' favorite Kirby comic, I think, is Commanding. And there's a lot of Commanding, which is a book that I worked on the first 2 issues of, and I left Jack's employment. And I wasn't a big fan of Commanding when he was done. Years later, I had to do a Commanding book for DC after Jack left the project. I went back and reread all these Commanding comics. And I was stunned. I said, how did I miss these? When I read them initially, I didn't like them, and now I love them. And I'm suddenly understanding the stories. And the ultimate answer I came to the conclusion for myself was, I was too damn stupid to figure these things out the first time I read them. I didn't understand what was happening with some of these stories. I just missed it. And once you understand what Jack was doing,
Jack created the art for himself.
right there, that Jack created art for himself. Jack was very motivated about earning a living. Jack believed the most important thing in the entire world was to provide for your family. To the extent I had a connection with him this way, my father was roughly Jack's age. My father was Jewish. My father had grown up in similar impoverished childhood. My father had gone and earned a living at a very early age. My father was obsessed with, I have to have a paycheck every Friday. And Jack was like that. And one of the many reasons that I think he did not get his due financially in the business was he was too afraid of not having a paycheck. Sometimes you can't get your due if you're afraid to walk out the door. And Jack had 4 children. He had a lot of expenses. He didn't live extravagantly. And all the time he was fighting for more money. This is key to know about Jack. In the 80s, there were a lot of battles where the industry was rallying people who'd been exploited. His artwork was being stolen from him and such. When he was fighting for more money, he was not fighting the way some of us might say, I should have more money because I want a bigger house with servants, and I want a yacht. He wanted to leave his widow enough money that she would never need. He wanted to leave his kids money so they could have medical expense. The basic necessities of life is what he was always fighting for. And when he started having problems with his eyes in the 70s, his eyesight was not going well. He got terrified of what happens if I can't draw, what's going to become of my family. He was fighting. And that was a big motivator. And it was a major thing in his stories. This character he did named Orion, who represented Jack. The other theme, if you ever read the New Gods comics, one of the under themes of Evanier was that sometimes in this world you have to do things you're not happy with for a greater purpose. You have to surrender to make certain compromise or fight certain battles that you wish you had because your number one priority is to provide for your family.
You can see Orion in the big girl over here, this sort of figure with the orange hair in his head, and dark speaks as the characters on view. So, on the collage front,
Yeah.
there are things that Kirby, I guess.
Well, Jack did these collages. I don't know whether I actually cut out some of the pieces for them. And showed them. And I'll tell you a secret here. I hope you don't get the gallery shut down. Some of these pictures were cut out of issues of Playboy. There are pictures of naked women that are now meteors in those drawings. But he liked doing that. And to some extent it was for himself. To some extent it was like, I want to do different things in comics. Where can I use this? In the Fantastic Four, there was a thing called the negative zone. It's a story device, or another dimension which weird monsters came out of, and weird things happened when he went into it. And Jack, the negative zone was kind of created because Jack wanted to use, in the back of his mind, this never actually was realized, he wanted the negative zone to be done with collages. Whenever the characters went into there, he wanted to do all the backgrounds of the collages. Now, it didn't work because, as I mentioned, comic books were printed by the crummiest method possible. And a lot of these collages looked terrible in the printed copies. They really looked awful. And he kind of had to abandon his idea because the industry was not mature enough. Today, it would work. Because today we have much better printing in all comics. But back then, the industry hadn't caught up with Jack in terms of reproduction. So it was an idea, but he still did the collages for himself. He liked doing them. He used to complain because he was living in Thousand Oaks. And he'd ask my friend Steve, would you bring me some magazines? All I can get from Thousand Oaks is knitting magazines. And you can't make good monsters out of wool. Marvel was Jack's publisher a number of times. He worked for Marvel 3 times. In the early 40s, he and Joe Simon were on staff there. Joe was the senior editor, Jack was the art director. And that's when the first Captain America comics were done. He left Marvel because he and Joe believed they were being cheated on their percentage of profits. You've all heard of Hollywood accounting, where they give you 25% of the profits and then say, oh, there are no profits. Yes, we know the movie grows $3 billion, but somehow there's no profits. So he left Marvel because of that. He went back to Marvel in mid-50s because the industry was kind of collapsing. He needed work. He worked for them until 1970, and he left them because they wanted him to sign an owner's contract that he thought was insulting and impossible. He went to D.C. He had to work out of D.C., so he went back to Marvel in 1975, and he wasn't very happy there. He wasn't treated very well at that point. He had a lot of problems with the in-house staff. Some of them really didn't like his work, or didn't like his independence mostly. They wanted him drawing their stories instead of writing his own. And around the late 70s, I got Jack a connection with the animation business, and he left comics for animation. And except for one little two things here and there, he never really worked for Marvel again. And he worked for most of the major publishers. He worked for DC, three different tours of duty also. He worked for the Archie people briefly. He worked for just about every company that was around at that time. He worked for, well, yeah, Harvey. I mean, if you just go through these things, Black Magic was from his own company, which was, well, he was working for a company called Crestwood. He and Joe Simon packaged stuff with them. That page out of there, the Lotus for In Love, that was for a company called Mainline, which was Jack and Joe's own company that tried publishing it. The Sky Masters script was from the newspaper script that he did for a while. One page you gotta see it before you leave here. That page over there, the horizontal composition with pencil, that's from a story called Street Code, one of the last stories Jack did. A very wise publisher named Richard Kyle went to Jack, gave him the money, and said, draw me a 10-page story of anything that isn't Marvel or DC comics, whatever you want to do, something personal. And Jack had told Richard stories of growing up on the Lower East Side, his childhood, and Richard encouraged him to do either that or one of his war stories. And he did this beautiful, magnificent story. If you pick up my book, Kirby, King of Comics, which is getting really cheaper and cheaper on Amazon as we speak, I printed the whole story there off the original negatives, and it is an amazing story that explains who Jack was. Well, yeah, Jack's family has money now. This is nice. There was finally a, you may have read about this lawsuit. It's very complicated. I think I paid Jack back for a lot of what he gave me by giving 2 6-hour depositions in this lawsuit. And his family settled for a very, very large amount of money to borrow. Now their needs are all taken care of. It almost went to the Supreme Court in this case. It stopped 1 day short of the Supreme Court agreeing to hear the case or not agreeing to hear the case. They settled out of court. Yes?
That is fascinating because James Gardner, the rocket fire,
Yes, James Gardner.
went into syndication.
Yes.
The company, the current company, was not paying him enough, and he sued.
Yeah, James Garner, the achievement of the Rocket House, one of the most successful TV shows ever done, and he had a percentage of the profits. And year after year, they told him there are no profits here. The show hasn't made any money, and he sued them. There have been a bunch of these lawsuits where someone, Alan Alda did this on MASH, and such. But yeah, I think William Shatner was sued over Star Trek about 33 times. And so yes. Go ahead.
Well, as I listened to both of you, like you said, gave a comparison of the comics I know anything about, are the comics in the Los Angeles Times. And I'm thinking about Bizarro, and I'm thinking about, well, you don't have to come up with a new script 7 days a week. And I think about scale. The script is pretty small and heavy, but when we run it, it has to be a lot bigger. But my basic question is, how much money can one of the cartoonists published in the LA Times make?
Well, I work for a man named Jim Davis, who created Garfield, and Jim can buy this whole campus. And those are the lottery winners. People think, oh, every newspaper script makes that money. Yeah, because they hear of one guy who wins the lottery. Most comic strip artists do not make that kind of money. Bizarro, the strip you mentioned, is a very successful strip. It doesn't have the kind of merchandising that Garfield Peanuts has. It's a fascinating
So he makes
kind of thing.
a good living.
Dan Ferraro makes a really good living, and he deserves to. And one of the reasons and we should emphasize this, one of the reasons that comic book artists make decent livings today is that Jack Kirby said no to a lot of rotten deals and set the example. And as in the motion picture business, you now hear about Adam Sandler or Will Ferrell making $80–30 million a movie, and then you look back and where he's Spencer Tracy and Clark Gable didn't make that kind of money even proportionately. And it's always the later people who break out and benefit. The same way, Jack didn't benefit from a lot of the changes in the business. He didn't benefit directly from them either. But he was a big champion of it. And some of the pages on these walls were loaned by a fellow named Eric Larson, so his name is the loaner. And Eric was a guy who, a superstar comic artist who got into business later and benefited from and acknowledges. And his people tried to give back to Jack in many ways. They promised to pay Jack some money in his later years and share profits with him. And there's a very nice story here where the people who grew up on Jack's work, to a large extent, took care of him and honored him. And when we run around to exhibits at 10 o'clock in the morning in Northridge and talks about him and such, because we love him so much. On a level, I cannot find you somebody in the motion picture or television industry or any other media who is comparable to Jack in their importance and how much they are adored. There's lots of great movie stars that were adored and honored, and lots of great painters and such. I can't find a comparable person to Jack. dominated his own field so much.
Let's end it at that.
That's it, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.